Adventurous Audio. From idea to ear, we make audio an adventure. Just a word of warning, this podcast series contains graphic descriptions and content you may find upsetting from the outset.
We have such an awful job. They say that, forensically, we're the modern day sin eaters. We eat the sins of the world so nobody else has to do it. You don't have to do this body recovery. You don't have to put these pieces together. You don't have to determine how this person died. We do. And it's easier for us if they're body one and body two, and we remain scientifically remote and clinical as much as we possibly can. It's for our own well-being and our own mental health.
Moffat mystery, mutilated bodies found in Lynn. Dumfriesshire police are investigating a gruesome discovery made yesterday by two women while walking in Gardenholme, 2 miles north of Moffat on the main Edinburgh Road.
Last night they definitely established that the victims of the tragedy were an adult man and an adult woman. The body of the woman was complete, with the exception of the right forearm and hand. In the case of the man, the trunk, both feet, and the right upper arm are missing.
The removal not only of features such as ears and eyes from the heads, but all the skin of the face and of parts of the bodies must have occupied a long time and required entire freedom from interruption. There have been about 24 parcels discovered, some of them containing several pieces of flesh. Anyone who wished to destroy with care and knowledge the chance of identification could, I was informed, have done it in far less time and with far less work. The two theories in this case were that the man was a maniac, or that, in terror of discovery, he mutilated the bodies far more than was necessary.
So who did the body parts belong to? Why might someone have gone to such extraordinary lengths to try to remove their identity? And how would police find the maniac behind the double murder? I'm Penny Stewart, and this is Inside Forensic Science, a case of stolen identity. Episode 2, Sin Eaters. All the excerpts you'll hear during the series are taken from the later trial papers.
Professor John Glaister. I am a registered medical practitioner, hold various degrees and qualifications, and am Regius Professor of Forensic Medicine at the University of Glasgow. On 1st of October 1935, in company with Dr. Gilbert Miller, I visited Gardenholme Lynn, near Moffat, and also went to Moffat Cemetery Mortuary, where I saw certain human remains which were subsequently removed to the Department of Anatomy in the University of Edinburgh. Since 2nd of October, I, in conjunction with other gentlemen, have conducted an investigation on these remains.
In 1935, Professor John Glaister was about as close as it comes to a celebrity in the field of forensic medicine. The son of the acclaimed Professor of Forensic Medicine, also named John Glaister, he was a hugely respected forensic science practitioner and academic in his own right, as well as a Fellow of the Royal Society. On visiting the deposition site at Gardenholme Lynn, it was Professor John Glaister Jr. who ordered samples to be gathered from where the body parts had been found. Soil, foliage, even the maggots and bluebottle flies, which had covered the parcels of flesh, were scooped up for later examination. Having visited the ravine, Glaister, along with a lecturer in pathology at the University of Edinburgh, Dr. William Miller, made their way to the mortuary in Moffat, where they took an inventory of the body parts and made an initial assessment of what they found.
I had very little doubt about the first body, body number 1, which was obviously that of a woman, but the second body, body number 2, or those portions of it which had been recovered, posed a much more difficult problem and troubled me to a considerable degree. Like a lot of these other remains, the head had been mutilated. I told Chief Constable Black that the skull had certainly male characteristics about it. It's too early to be certain, but the probability is that we are dealing with the bodies of a man and a woman.
There are 4 basic parameters that we will start to try to determine from the body.
Sue Black is a professor of anatomy and forensic anthropology and the president of St John's College, Oxford.
What sex were they? We're much more careful in terms of that definition now than I think we've ever been. So it's about taking biological information and taking circumstantial information, so the clothes that they're wearing, things they may be carrying, and biological identities. And we are generally saying, are they masculine or feminine? But we're not saying, are they male or female?
Late on the Monday evening, Chief Constable Black shared what little information he was able. That the remains belonged to 2 bodies, what appeared to be a younger woman and an older man. They'd been dead for some time and were not thought to be local. Murder was suspected. While the press rushed off to fill their newspaper columns and the police started looking for a missing persons report which fitted the limited information they had, the body parts were removed to a laboratory in the anatomy department at the University of Edinburgh, where Glaister and Miller were joined by another hugely eminent expert of the day, Professor James Cooper Brash.
I am a registered medical practitioner and Professor of Anatomy at the University of Edinburgh. On the 10th of October 1935 and subsequent dates, I carried out an examination of the portions of 2 bodies shown in the photographs included in Exhibits 135 to 143 inclusive. I first saw the remains on the day that the boxes were opened in the anatomy department at Edinburgh University. The boxes contained all the remains moved from Moffat, which had been found in the ravine.
So we would do it pretty much in exactly the same way as it was done at the time. How many feet do you have? How many heads do you have? How many hands do you have? I mean, it sounds so ridiculous. But if you have 3 feet, you've got more than one person. And if you've got 2 feet that look the same and are the same size, they probably belong to one person. So you've probably got 2. It's how many people have I got, first of all? And that really is about the maximum number of a particular body part. And then you will have 2 heads. So you put 2 heads on 2 trolleys. And then you start to go down the body. Do these 2 limbs belong together? And what you can do is you can actually interface the 2 cut sections of a joint. Now, the shoulders don't go terribly well together because they're such a lax joint. But every other joint, putting the head onto the torso, putting the arms onto the forearms, putting the hips onto the pelvis, all of those, the bones will fit together. And they did that.
Just explain what you did.
Having satisfied myself that not more than 2 bodies were represented amongst these remains, I proceeded to assemble the trunk portions together. First, I placed together the upper portions of the trunk, which contained the whole of the skeleton of the chest, with the lower part of the trunk, which contained the skeleton of the pelvis or basin. These 2 came together in the lumbar region, and there were 2 of the 5 lumbar vertebrae attached to the upper part of the trunk and 3 to the lower part. I found that they articulated together perfectly.
So they were doing that jigsaw thing that says, does the bit fit? And when it fits, then the chances are it belongs. Now what we would do, once we had as much of the body together as we thought belonged to one person, we would DNA type every single part to make sure that actually they all belong to the same individual. That was the only thing they didn't have available to them. But it looked to me, when you look at the body parts and you look at the photographs, they did exactly what we would have done.
And what was the age of that one, in your opinion?
I can only give it within a range, but in my opinion, the age of body number 1 was certainly not less than 18 and certainly not more than 25.
Once we know whether we're dealing with a man or a woman, then we will ask how old were they when they died. Now, if it's a young person, so it's a child, then we're very good at determining their age, and we can get it to within sometimes a few months. If it's a baby, it can be to within weeks of their known age. If it's a child, it can be within a year or so. But as you get older, all the indicators of your age stop being progressive and start to be degenerative, which is really depressing. and we all degenerate at different rates. So some of us get old very quickly, and some of us take a long time to get old. So that as we get to the adult stage, our age range increases. So in a child, we might say it's someone between the ages of 10 and 12 years of age. By the time we get into the adult, we're saying it's somebody who's an adult. They're over 25, but they're probably under 35. Or we might be saying it's somebody who's over 40, but probably under 70.
Can you tell us the height and age approximately of body number 2?
Body number 2 is certainly older than body number 1, but I cannot state the probable age within such a narrow range. It is certainly over 30 years of age, and certainly under 55. The height of the body, measured from reconstruction, was about 5 feet 4 1/4 inches.
Is that the best you can help us with regard to the age of body number 2?
No, I can give you an opinion a little closer. I've given the extreme range. My opinion, on the balance of all the evidence available about the age of body number 2, is that it lay within the decade between 35 and 45.
But if you've got dismembered parts and you don't have a full body, you can only look at what you've got. If I had a preference of the areas of the body to give me some indication of the age individual, I'd like to have a head, please, because then I have teeth, which are useful. I like to have the sutures within the skull. And then if I have another part, I'd like to be down in the pelvis, please, because there are areas in the pelvis that show quite well-defined age-related changes. And I quite like the collarbone. So just the middle end of the collarbone here keeps growing till you're about 25. And so if I have that, I'm quite content if that's still growing, that the person's under 25. And I'll go straight to an area of the sacrum down at the base of the spine. And I would expect the gap between the first and the second sacral vertebrae to be open. That would confirm to me they're under 25. But I'd look at the long bones and say, well, they're over 16, they're over 18. They're somewhere in that 18 to 25 bracket. But as you get older, really the changes you're looking at are degenerative. So you're looking for arthritic change. You're looking for bone breakdown. You're looking for bone loss. You're looking for tooth loss, for example, as well. You're looking for your sutures closing over. And they're all so variable that really until you have that body in front of you, you don't know which bits to go and look for because you don't know what you've got. If it's a child, then, there's so many pieces of information for us. That's why we can get so close to an age, because it's all about where the bones are growing and what stage of maturity they've got to.
The whole hideous business has produced very little evidence to prove anything at all beyond the fact that the mutilated bodies were apparently not of tramp class. The hands were soft and were not those of a woman who had done any manual work. I next asked about the state of the fingernails, and Mr. Black replied that while the fingernails did not show evidence of what might be called elaborate care, they had evidently, nevertheless, been carefully manicured and the cuticles pushed back. These facts, while not necessarily suggesting a woman of high social position, seem to rule out any possibility that the woman was a vagrant. Furthermore, while the description of her teeth indicates that a number were missing and that there was no evidence of dental treatment, the reference to one tooth as noticeably decayed suggests that the rest were in sound condition.
By the 6th of October 1935, the body parts had started to reveal something of their story to the team of experts examining them. In a report on their progress, police surgeon Mr. D.P.D. Wilkie concluded,
"From the elaborate and systematic manner in which the bodies had been cut up, it appeared to me that certain conditions must have been present. 1. Time of at least 8 hours for the work of dismemberment. 2. A table with good light and large sharp knives. 3. Someone either with a knowledge of human anatomy or with experience of cutting up animals. I base these conclusions on the following observations. The great majority of the incisions were clean cut and purposive, not hacked or ragged, and suggested that they were made by someone who was accustomed to cutting flesh. The elbow joints were clearly disarticulated without injury to the cartilaginous surfaces. A difficult piece of work for the uninitiated.
Wilkie goes on to say,
The procedures which had been carried out to remove all possible marks for identification were very thorough and betokened considerable knowledge.
so just how difficult is it to erase someone's identity?
If you have the skills, then it is relatively straightforward if you have the skills. But when you remove things that are identifiable, what you're doing is you're putting a flag in the ground that says there was something here that was worth removing. So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. And, you know, the partial removal of areas is not something I would do. If I was dismembering somebody, I wouldn't do partial removal of the areas of ID. I would remove everything, because you're not leaving that signal behind that says there was something here worth removing. What could it be? Either do it properly or don't do it at all. But just removal of it is only a partial success, and that's partly where he fell down.
I submit that the dismemberment and mutilation of the two subjects was not the work either of a maniac or ignorant individual, but must have been carried out by someone with previous knowledge of cutting up a body and familiar with the medical legal value used in identification.
In most dismemberment cases, someone takes a knife and they cut through the limb and they get to the bone and they realize that the blade won't go through the bone. So what they do is they go and get a saw and they cut through the body parts with a saw. Because he had anatomical experience, he jointed the body. He didn't cut it up into pieces, he jointed it like you would a chicken. And that comes with experience. So the dismemberment really wouldn't have taken a lot of time at all, because he would know anatomically exactly where to cut through to remove the limbs, to remove at the elbows, to remove at the knees. All of that is straightforward. The one that's difficult is the head. Because the head, when you look at the vertebrae, they sit a bit like Lego blocks, that they overlap each other. So you really have to know what you're doing. There was no evidence he used a saw at all. So that would have been the tricky one, because you have to remove all of the soft tissue at the front of your throat to be able to see the vertebrae at the back, to be able to get the blade in and to separate the head from the rest of the trunk. It takes expertise and it takes knowledge. Now, I don't see in the reports anywhere that it talks about the pathologist really making detailed examination of how and the different parts were separated. But I suspect they would have done. And the anatomist, Brash, would have known exactly, you know, this is somebody who is dismembering exactly the same way that I would do it as an anatomist or a surgeon.
So far, the police search for any reports of a missing man and woman had drawn a blank. Back in Moffat, Sergeant Sloane, having carefully dried, preserved and noted the dates and titles of the newspapers which had wrapped the body parts, started investigating whether he could find out more about the circulation of those particular newspaper editions.
This evening, Chief Constable Black stated that the police, in addition to other lines of inquiry, have been engaged today in an examination of the pieces of newspaper in which portions of the bodies were wrapped, and the cooperation of newspaper offices will be sought in order to find what editions were used, and if the district from which the bodies were brought can thus be narrowed down, although not establishing beyond doubt that the bodies were dismembered in that district. Incidentally, however, this ability to decide the district from which a newspaper was obtained is conceivably just the kind of small point which a criminal might overlook.
Sloane sent inquiries to police stations in the two major cities in the UK where papers were printed, Manchester and London. If they could narrow down where the newspapers had come from, then maybe they could narrow down the search area, both for the victims and the perpetrator. On one thing Sloane was clear. Given the most recent of the newspapers was dated the 15th of September 1935, the body parts couldn't have been deposited more than 2 weeks before they were found on the 29th of September. But could that window be narrowed down any further?
In reply to another question I put to him, Mr. Black said that while the medical examination thus far had indicated that death took place about 10 days ago yesterday, it was not possible to say how many days the dismembered bodies had lain in the ravine before they were discovered.
Professor Glaister, having ordered that the debris from around the deposition site in the ravine was gathered up, then had the various maggot specimens sent to a laboratory at the University of Glasgow to be examined by a colleague, a physician and public health expert called Dr. Alexander G. Mearns. While Glaister had been interested in the field for some time, this was the first time forensic entomology was used in a case in the UK.
Forensic entomology is basically using insects to help in criminal investigations.
Dr. Martin Hall is an entomologist and scientific associate at the Natural History Museum in London.
So, for example, major investigations of unexplained death, usually suicides and homicides, or even neglect, where the victim's still alive, and that's often neglect of children or the elderly. And the insects are able to give a variety of clues as to the investigation. So, for example, the primary one is time of death, or more accurately, when the flies found the body. But they can also contribute to the cause of death, the place of death, or even identity of victim. And that can be very important where you don't even have a victim, because, you might think, well, obviously you can identify the victim, but sometimes the victim's been moved, but the insects that were feeding on the victim have remained, and you can extract their DNA and identify the victim in that way.
Mearns didn't have access to DNA as an investigative tool, but the process he used was much the same as it would be today.
The first thing to do was to identify the insect, and the second thing was to age the insects. And the first part, the identification, was the most critical, really, because different insects develop at different rates, even closely related species. So it's very important to identify them first. Many people say, well, why do we do forensic work at the Natural History Museum? It's because we have access to vast collections, 30 million insects at the museum. So we're very well equipped to put the right name on an insect. And that identification and then application of knowledge of developmental times is the same course that was undertaken by Alexander Mearns, the entomologist involved in this particular case. It's the same thing as was done then as I would do now, identifying and then aging. Basically, if you can age the insects, you're saying when those insects first found the body, and that can very reliably give you a time of death or a minimum post-mortem interval.
Do we know how fast an insect might find a body?
Well, most insects, particularly the insects that were found in this case, which were blowflies, they're not flying around at night time. They're active, they're diurnal insects, so they're active during daylight hours. But when they are active, they respond very readily to odours of decomposition, and with a much finer sense of smell than ours. And in terms of how quickly they arrive, it can be very quickly after death. So in a summer, if a body's dumped outside, it can be just a few minutes, certainly hours, in which the flies arrive and begin their investigation. And they may not lay eggs, they may actually just be arriving to feed themselves. But if the females are ready to lay their eggs, then they can do so just within a few minutes, hours of death.
How much is the entomology going to show date of death, or is it date of when these body parts were likely dumped in the ravine?
Well, that's a really good question, because it all depends on the circumstances around this particular case. For example, if death had taken place, say it's like early evening, and dismemberment had been carried out overnight, it's unlikely that the insects would have colonised the bodies at the scene. And of course, they may well have been wrapped in some way to keep insects off the bodies during the time. So it's actually quite difficult to say where exactly the body parts were first colonised. The fly that was responsible In this case, was a blue bottle fly called Califera vicina, a blue bottle fly. And it's very common. In fact, Ken Smith wrote the very first manual of forensic entomology in the UK in 1986, and he put their Califera vicina as the commonest species on human bodies, especially in urban environments. And my own work on well over 100 cases, 85% of the cases indoors, Califera vicina was present, and in 75% of the cases outdoors. So you can see it's very common, both indoor and outdoor, but a slight preference for indoor bodies to be colonised by it. So it could have colonised the body parts where they were dismembered, but it is highly likely that they could be colonised in that ravine as well. And so, it's between time of death and time of dumping at the scene.
Mearns concluded that the body parts had been dumped in the ravine 12 to 14 days before they were discovered, which made the date of deposition the 16th or 17th of September.
If we put this case on one side for a moment, in the summer in the UK, I would say that this species, Califera vicina, you could probably estimate death within 1 day. But during the winter, because temperature affects development, so at higher temperatures, the insects develop quicker than they do at lower temperatures. So during the summer, accuracy to within about a day is fine. But during the winter, the accuracy might be to within a week or a couple of weeks even. In this particular case, it was in September. So I think the estimates from the entomologists at that time, bearing in mind whether they included temperature estimates in any great accuracy, I should think to within a couple of days, 2 to 3 days was reasonable.
While Mearns was conducting his analysis of the blue bottlefly larva, Sergeant Sloane had received significant news from Scotland Yard regarding the newspapers. He reported back to Chief Constable Black.
The portions of the Sunday Graphic and Sunday News newspapers of 15th of September, which I had sent to London, was part of a slip edition numbering 3,700 copies, which had been prepared in connection with a carnival held at Morecambe on 4th of September, and had been issued to a few distributing agents in a very small areas around Morecambe.
This was a huge breakthrough for the investigating officers, and the Lancashire Police were immediately contacted. But as yet, they'd had no reports of a man and a woman going missing. Chief Constable Black gathered the investigating officers together, and as he told them about the focus on the Morecambe area, it struck a chord with one of the Glasgow officers, Lieutenant Ewing, who mentioned a story he'd seen in the newspaper just that morning about a missing nursemaid from Lancaster.
The disappearance of Mary Rogerson, a pretty 21-year-old nurse girl who vanished 3 weeks ago from the house of a well-known local doctor, has caused her parents, who live in Morecambe, grave anxiety. Following various inquiries, they have communicated with the police. She just vanished, says Doctor. I can well understand the worry Mary's disappearance has caused her parents, and I too feel very concerned. Dr. Ruxton, who spoke excellent English, told me she was the best of nurse girls, and there was nothing she would not do for my 3 children. My wife and I have always thought the world about Mary.
Could the missing girl, Mary Jane Rogerson, be body 1? The body Glaister and Brash had identified as a woman.
And so that's a really good place to start, because you've got an ante-mortem set of information that says somebody's missing, and you've got a post-mortem set of information that says a body's been found. And the job is to see, do these two match? Could that ante-mortem information match with that post-mortem information? Sometimes it will, in which case we've got an identification, and that's brilliant. Other times it won't. And that means that the person you've got is not the person you thought you had on the missing persons list. If we can get down to a name, and ultimately that's what we're trying to get to, is a name, then we can start to investigate the timing and the pattern and the behaviour and the route that somebody has taken, when they last took money out of their bank account, when they last used their phone. But until we know who that person was, then we've got nobody we can go and talk to. We can't talk to their family or their friends or their colleagues. We can't look for them on CCTV because we don't know who they are and where they came from. We can't go to their bank. So getting to their name is really important as swiftly as we possibly can, because that's what opens up the police routes for investigation.
So who was Mary Jane Rogerson? What was the story behind her disappearance? And how, given how many identifying marks had been removed from the dismembered bodies, could the police and scientists prove she was body number 1, even if they thought she might be? And if Mary Jane Rogerson was body number 1, then who was the man they believed to be body number 2? Coming up in the next episode of Inside Forensic Science, a case of stolen identity.
Identification isn't really for the sake of the deceased. It's for the families, it's for the living. So the families of the deceased have a right, really, to know what has happened to their loved one and for their remains to be named and therefore returned to the families. It says a lot about society, about how we treat the dead and how we identify the dead. And I would wish for my relatives to be treated in a way that I act as a practitioner, because identification is so key to understanding how someone has died and therefore how they're respected in their death.
In episode 2 of Inside Forensic Science, a case of stolen identity, the experts were Professor Sue Black and Dr. Martin Hall. The actors were Alan Wall, Yana Miller, Sam Young, Neil Wallace, Mark Stephen, Jake Lee, Mary Hemsworth, Chris Young, Pam McIntosh and Alan Richardson. Inside Forensic Science is written and narrated by me, Penny Stewart. The story consultants and researchers are Heather Duran and Clara Morris. The series is mixed by Steve Bull. Inside Forensic Science is an Adventurous audio production for the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee and is funded by the Leverhulme Trust.